Notes for conservative debate with Jeremy. Okay. Right. So
we just lost 3 viewers.
So I've said many times that social movements are claims makers in society or civil society. Social movements often identify what they characterize as social problems, and then they make claims about them. And obviously, there are some counter movements which struggle against what the social movements want, etc. Those claims are driven by the collective values of the people in the movement. Veganism as a social movement is about justice and anti-oppression. It's opposed to the exploitation and oppression of sentient life, as Donald Watson wrote in 1945. So I think today's debate gets us into the territory of vegan values, because at heart it's about who we are, what values are important to us, and what values we align with. I was going to say glibly that I could probably win this debate this week by uttering 2 words, Donald Trump. But I won't do that, and we'll probably get back to grab a pussy later, but not for now. Today's session also is not about party politics as such. It's more about politics and political spectrums, that kind of idea. So Tony Judt, the author of Ill Fares the Land, it's a 2010 book, writes this: something is profoundly wrong with the way we live today. For 30 years, we have made a virtue out of the pursuit of material self-interest. Indeed, this very pursuit now constitutes whatever remains of our sense of collective purpose. We know what things cost, but we have no idea about what they're worth. We no longer ask if a judicial ruling or legislative act, is it good? We don't ask that. Or is it fair? Is it just? Is it right? Will it help bring about a better society or a better world? So I'm going to follow, in general terms, a model that George Monbiot set out in a recent talk. And he talked about neoliberalism, consumerism or consumption, and capitalism. If we go to neoliberalism, it's an idea that originated around about the 1930s, but its major development was in the 1970s and associated with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Then, sadly for some people, tragically for other people, it continued within New Labour in Britain and within the Clinton administration in the States. What neoliberalism says about humans is that we are selfish beings, that we are inherently selfish, and we are greedy. We may remember the 1988 film Wall Street, in which the character played by Michael Douglas declares that greed is good, greed is right, and greed works. Neoliberalism says that this is just what we're like. It also says that the market is king. Neoliberalism values competition over cooperation. It says that competition is the defining characteristic of human relations, and that we should live in a system of winners and losers, sometimes known as capitalism. And it's within a rigged system which is called a meritocracy. So going back to Tony Foots, the historian, he says that most university graduates in the 1950s and 1960s saw themselves using their skills and their learning, in general terms, in aid of public service. Self-value was tied to community service, he says. By the 1980s, and this is the shift into neoliberalism, Judt says that graduate aspirations were all about making as much money as possible. Now, Ruger, are you going to try and disrupt my statements? You are, aren't you?
Ruger.
Yeah, so that brings us to, well, if you want to know a bit more about all that, there's a good series on YouTube called Century of the Self. It is 4 hours long, but it's well worth watching. tells the story about the transformation from human need into human wants. It's really interesting. And you can also see a shorter film called The Story of Stuff, which is really interesting. So that brings us to consumerism. Consumerism is an ideology, although not many people think of it that way, which makes it a very good ideology indeed. And the ideology of consumerism tells us that our well-being is tied to us having lots and lots of stuff. Having stuff is a status symbol. The richer we are, the more stuff we have. Monbiot claims that the corporate world sells stuff to us via celebrities and a kind of shallow, come on then, Rouge. Come on. There, well done.
Just for those who are curious, Roger's currently being disrupted by his cat friend, which I think is a brilliant element of this debate. So I say, Roger, keep at it. Scratch your legs and everything right when you're making points.
Who's been asleep all day until now. So Monbiot talks about celebrity culture. We see this now in the vegan community. We know something is good because some rich celeb tells us so. Celebrities provide a mask for ruthless corporations to hide behind, Monbiot claims. And one thing within the movement that illustrates this, and you can Google image this, is the London Greenpeace image at the front of their infamous leaflet called What's Wrong with McDonald's? And it shows Ronald McDonald mask hiding a kind of corporate structure. So finally, capitalism. Capitalism, Monbiot argues, is inherently incompatible with the survival of our life support system. In other words, life on Earth. Capitalism is based on winners and losers, rulers and followers, rich and poor. Of course, it promises the poor that they too can become rich. The economic growth that would entail would require the planetary resources to inflate like a balloon, which of course it cannot because our resources are finite. Capitalism is based on economic growth when the survival of our planet, our habitat, requires massive degrowth. So I want just to finish off by reading from the beginning of my chapter in this book, which is David Nybert's collection. And I started off with a quote which goes, in a video entitled Understanding Sociology, Making Sense of Sociological Theory, Anthony Giddens, who's a famous sociologist, explains what he regards as the chief defining characteristic of the capitalist economic system. And he says it's everything can be bought and sold. And the narrator of the video adds, including people. When Anthony Nocella II gave a presentation to my group, the Vegan Information Project, in 2014, he said that, this is bringing it back to our movement now, he says that when people in progressive movements are asked, you know, what's wrong with vegan and rights people, they answer things like, they just don't get capitalism. So he says that this is a modern day movement problem for us, that we, in the eyes of progressive movements, are just not taken seriously. Nocella says that they have good reason not to. Quote, this is a quote from his presentation. We have to acknowledge right off the bat that animal rights people are very single issue. Maybe not the people in this room, but there are a lot of other people like Peter that give you all a bad name. For the moment you walk into a room, they think, this is progressive people, you are a member of Peter, right? So they think you are sexist, ableist, and racist. Right off the bat, they think you're vegan and you don't get other issues. They might even think that you're a Republican, a conservative, or neo-Nazi. So that's Nocella's take on it. And the final line comes from this book by David Nybert, when he says this: the answer to the question by philosopher and activist Susan Finson, posed in chapter 1 of the book, is corporate capitalism compatible with animal rights, is no. For that matter, corporate capitalism is not compatible with the end of racism, sexism, classism, and other injustices. Now, what Nybert would argue is that what we would then need is a genuine form of socialism, which some people would argue with in the sense that some anarchists would argue with that, for example. But that's the general problem that we've got. Our values, vegan values, where do they fit? What does it align to in the political spectrum? And can they align with conservative values? And the answer seems to be, for me, no. So, Jeremy.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, I think that helps frame the conversation well. I know the preparation I've done for this is more in the detail that I think we can unpack together. I mean, there's several different ways to approach this question, isn't there? I mean, to me, it's first, like you say, about values, and I think those are important questions to be asking. The first question I would be asking is, can people hold inconsistent values? I don't know any animal advocate who would argue against this, because look at how many so-called animal lovers still support animal use. So even if we were to take the position, which I think you've made a good case for, that there is some potential inconsistencies in the values, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't hold these inconsistent values at the same time. So there's that. I mean, I think another thing that's going to inevitably come up throughout this conversation, and which has been circling the animal circles, is whether or not veganism is political. And the chat that one of our fellow co-hosts of the Animal Rights Show, Tom Gilbatten, took part in recently. Catherine Klein was also on that chat, and I really liked how she said that it's political but nonpartisan, which really speaks to me, because I think, I mean, I've said the chat has been absolutely booming. So, for those watching, hopefully, we can tie in as much with the chat as much as possible, so we can keep along similar threads. Because, I mean, something that's been raised is, is anybody that votes vegan? Because I think when we look at political parties in general, none of them really support the idea of animal rights as, non-rhetorical animal rights, the whole theme behind the Animal Rights Show. The best we can hope for is animal welfare. So what are we actually talking about now? Do different parties tend to vote along different lines? Absolutely. I've seen that discussed in the chat as well. I will definitely put my hand up and say and agree that, different parties tend to lean different ways, but it's either really leaning towards animal rights, or are they actually just different versions of animal welfare? I mean, I think we'll get into the detail in a moment. I think that will help answer that question a little bit better, but kind of leaves the question, if we're going to say conservatives can't be vegan, can anyone be vegan? I mean, the Green Party, can they be vegan? Because they're not necessarily supportive of animal rights in a direct sense. Labor's not, speaking in UK terms. Shifting to the US, Democrats, Republicans, who's the vegan party there? Looking around the world, what is the mainstream political party that is in full support of animal rights, non-rhetorical animal rights? I can't think of anyone. If anyone knows of one, please share it in the chat. But to me, it doesn't exist. So really, we're talking about differences in degree, not in kind. All of the mainstream political parties are obviously different degrees, but they're all opposed to animal rights in a sense, because let's be honest, they follow society, they don't lead it. So I think, I mean, let's just make sure I've kind of got all the notes I've been taking here. I mean, I think another big key question here is we're going to kind of break this conversation down into two parts. First, the theoretical, and we're going to look at some definitions here, which I think will be interesting. Is it even possible? Are the values just too inconsistent? But then secondarily, how do we approach this from a practical or from a strategic perspective? If we're doing outreach on the street and we, for whatever reason, we come to the knowledge that the other person's conservative, do we just say, oh, you know what? You can't be vegan, and then send them on their way? Do we, in social media circles, if someone, says they're conservative, do we say, oh, well, you can't be vegan and conservative, and then shun them in that sense before we even start to have those conversations like Roger's just done with the, inviting the different ideas around values? So, I mean, I think the whole idea is just really to get us all thinking about this. I don't think we'll necessarily have an answer at the end of the session, but hopefully just through the conversation, we can get us all thinking about these important topics that as a social movement, I think it's essential to understand our values and how to communicate those values to others. Because I think Roger and I are in agreement that we want to inspire as many people to be vegan as possible, with the caveat that while people that may have inconsistent views. We want to be able to challenge those views, but also not welcome people in with oppressive views. I think we'd also agree on that. So I think I see this us converging a lot. While we may start out at a bit different points, I see there being common ground between these two perspectives. And I hope if Roger and I can find common ground here today, that perhaps we can nudge a lot of people within the movement towards finding common ground, because I think that's what's seriously lacking on a lot of these pivotal issues is actually looking at the practical applications and where do we agree and where we don't. Because as animal advocates, I think we agree on a heck of a lot more than what we don't agree on.